The honourable member for Sackville Eastern Shore.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And before I start, I just wanted to answer the question over there from the Conservative MP. If he honestly believes that new budgetary framework will come in for Veterans Affairs and introduce it in a private bill, introduce it into a government bill, like they did in Bill C-55, which we fully supported, by lumping this into an overall budget with thousands upon thousands of other spending items and cuts and everything else, that means we would have to express confidence of the government. And I can assure you, Mr. Speaker, it'll be a long, long day before we in the NDP ever express confidence in that government. I can assure you that. But, Mr. Speaker, today we're here to talk about a very important motion brought in by my colleague. And the fact is, Mr. Speaker, it's an honor, and at the same time, it's a bit of sadness that we have to bring this to the floor of the House of Commons. Veterans should not have to fight and to struggle to get the veterans that they so rightfully deserve. They have already fought, Mr. Speaker, for this country. It is their country, regardless of political affiliation, regardless of government or opposition, that owes them the unlimited responsibility, the ultimate responsibility, because they have the unlimited liability. The military, the RCMP, and their families deserve no less. Well, Mr. Speaker, let's go over a little bit of the history of the track record of this particular government. The reality is it took a 5-year lawsuit to settle the SISIP clawback, the insurance payment clawback, that was being deducted from disabled veterans. It took Judge Barnes in order to force this government into an $888 million lawsuit. If they had listened to us many years ago, it would have been settled, there would have been less angst among the veteran community, and it would have saved the government and the taxpayer a lot of money. But they did not. So now what happens, Mr. Speaker? They are now taking RCMP disabled veterans to court on the exact same type of issue. There's over 1,200 in a class action lawsuit right now against this government. And they have been asked by the RCMP, their families, they have been asked by the Royal Canadian Legion, they have been asked by us repeatedly to stop the court proceedings, work with the legal team and the RCMP veterans, and give them the respect and the dignity and the payment that they so rightfully deserve. But the answer, Mr. Speaker, no. We're going to go to the courts. There's another lawsuit going on, Mr. Speaker, with Equitas against the government over certain aspects of the new Veterans Charter. And what did the Crown attorneys for the government say in that lawsuit? Presenting the case to the government. Now, these are smart lawyers. They get their directions directly from the government. And I'm paraphrasing now, Mr. Speaker, but they indicated that there is no fiduciary or social moral responsibility for the veteran community. That only applies to the Aboriginal community. And I'm paraphrasing now. The veteran community was outraged when they heard this. I have asked the minister and the government on 6 separate occasions, do you or do you not have a moral, legal, social, and fiduciary responsibility to care for those you asked to put in harm's way? And what do you get, Mr. Speaker? Silence. Absolute silence. So, Mr. Speaker, we should not be too surprised when we saw what happened the other day. And I know the minister, deep down, probably regrets what happened. I'm sure that he does. But the reality is, Mr. Speaker, it happened. And this type of conduct happens with veterans across the country for 16 and a half years, through 10 different ministers from 2 different parties. What I saw and witnessed the other day was the lowest of the low. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, we had no choice. They brought in the so-called Veterans Bill of Rights, which we knew was toothless, because there is no punishment if you break a certain element of the Veterans Bill of Rights. You just say you're sorry and move on. But veterans, every single day of the year, Mr. Speaker, our veterans, RCMP, and their families deserve the utmost respect and the dignity and the courtesy. And it is our job, whether you're in government or in opposition, to listen to their concerns. We may not like what they're telling us. We may not like the manner in which they're telling us. But we get paid very well. Ministers get paid even better to listen to those concerns. It is our responsibility. We cannot sit here, Mr. Speaker, if it wasn't for the sacrifice of the men and women that put on the uniform and their families. and that of the RCMP who service in Canada. And, Mr. Speaker, they have the unlimited liability. That means they're willing to risk their lives so that you and I could be here. We again have the ultimate responsibility to their needs and to that of the families, all the way to and including the headstone. But, Mr. Speaker, a while back they brought in a budget and said we're spending millions more dollars on the last post fund. But the reality is, Mr. Speaker, they didn't change the litmus test who can qualify for the last post fund. If you make $12,000 or less, you may qualify to get a proper burial. If you make over that limit, you don't qualify. So even though they put more money into it, 2/3 of the applicants are still denied. And they refuse to correct that. Another one, Mr. Speaker, besides the closures of these offices, and I want to tell the people of Canada and this government right now, when they're kicked out of office in the next election, we in the NDP will reopen those offices and make them better to provide better services for the men and women who serve our country. But, Mr. Speaker, there's something else the government is doing, and many people are unaware of this. When the last Korean overseas veteran passes away, all the contract service beds across this country are finished, except for rare exceptions. What that means, Mr. Speaker, is right now, the Pearlie, the Camp Hill, the Belcher, and other hospitals across the country which service veterans, some of that money is paid for by the federal government. When the last Korean veteran dies, the modern-day veterans from 54 on will no longer have access to those beds paid for by the federal government. They are downloading this responsibility onto the backs of the provinces. Because as the previous Minister of Veterans Affairs said, health care is a provincial responsibility. I remind the government that the care and treatment of veterans, RCMP members and their families is a federal responsibility. Yeah. And to download this to the provinces is unacceptable. In Nova Scotia alone, it is a $41 million download. Is what they'll be doing in the near future. Unacceptable, Mr. Speaker, when we see floors of hospitals being closed for veterans uses and being transferred over to provincial uses. The men and women that serve our country deserve no less. They deserve to have the utmost treatment. As Rick Mercer once said, when you take them from heaven on earth, which is Canada, and send them over to hell on earth, give them the gold card. And make sure you give them platinum service when they come back. Right now, Mr. Speaker, and I will say there are many veterans that I deal with that are getting very good service from the Department of Veterans Affairs. That is true. I compliment the workers of the department who are providing that service. But the problem is, Mr. Speaker, many, many others are not getting that service. If you look at for the fact, Mr. Speaker, there's approximately 700,000 men and women in the, who retired from the military that are to be independent spouses. The DVA has only a client base of just over 200,000. So more than 2/3 of that base is not being serviced now. Now, many of them don't require the services, but they may in one day, Mr. Speaker, and many more veterans are coming online. But the reality is, Mr. Speaker, I want to highlight my constituents, Kim and Blair Davis. They've given me permission to do this, and the Minister's office knows this file very, very well. Because a few months ago, I did an open press conference with them. The man had a serious brain injury at a rollover lab accident explosion that killed a few of his buddies. He had major operations, and he's suffering severely from psychological problems, PTSD, and elsewhere. He has asked, Mr. Speaker, not for the government to give him a Rolex watch or a trip to Florida. He has asked for basic rehabilitation services. He has asked for things like VIP service to help him and his wife and his family. Several months go by, Mr. Speaker, I get an email yesterday saying, I'm at my wit's end with this government. I simply do not know where to turn. Please, please help me and my family. Why, Mr. Speaker, when we do a press conference, the government goes in, looks after this family, says, we're going to do all these things, and 2.5 months later, I get an email saying they haven't done anything yet. Mr. Speaker, this is indicative of a government that simply is not listening. And I want to say in my final words that I have here, Mr. Speaker, I implore the Minister of Veterans Affairs, the Minister of National Defense, please, please stop the cuts to these departments. Hire the mental health workers that are required. There should be no reason. You can say you pump money in, but if there's a bureaucracy delaying the hiring of these mental health workers, it is simply not working. I implore these two fine men to please get off their chairs and do something in a rational, speedy manner so that the men and women who serve our country, the RCMP and the military and their families will get the respect and the dignity they so rightfully deserve. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.